Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Today's Bible class 27, if you can believe it, the 27th time that we've gotten together in this way. I've entitled it "What Goes Around," from that phrase that I'm sure you know. What goes around comes around. That is, I think, what one point that we might draw from today's story. And as I said, it's a bit of a shorter lesson today, but that's because, as you'll see on our next slide, that these three chapters, 29 through 31, constitute a unified novella or short story assigned to the Yahweh source, or some assign it to the Yahweh source with some possible Elohist material woven in, although that's debated. They follow Jacob's flight from Esau and lead the reader quickly through Jacob's 20 years in Haran to the point of his return to Canaan. So 3 chapters covering 20 years. And so there are some great stories in here, but you can also look at it as a very broad overview of his time, with a lot of the gaps left unfilled. Because these chapters share a common scribal tradition with Genesis chapter 27, we should read these stories that follow as the fallout resulting from Jacob's trickery in relation to his father and his brother Esau in that chapter. You may recall that last week we considered some material from the priestly source and how the motivation for Jacob's leaving was to find a wife. Well, now we're back firmly on the track of Jacob leaving because he is afraid of his brother Esau. And that's why he is on the run. And taken in that light, we may well read the obstacles and trials that Jacob faces in the story that follows as the consequences of his actions. The trickster becomes the tricked, but also continues to trick, as we will find next in not next week's lesson, but in 2 weeks' lessons. A lesson 2 weeks from now. This story today marks a break in the overall narrative, which began with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. I should rather say it's a continuation of that narrative, but the break is in that in the stories up to this point, Abraham and his ancestors have made journeys back to the old country, Haran, for various reasons. This is the second time that Laban comes up as a character for that very reason. Fritham writes, family ties to the old country continue, but with Jacob, there will now be a permanent break from this part of the family. So this, what we're about to read, is the last time we have this return to the old country and a visitation with the old family. So on with the story. Genesis chapter 29. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. As he looked, he saw a well in the field and 3 flocks of sheep lying there beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large. And when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. Fritham writes in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, a stone covering the well is so large that only when all shepherds using the well are present can they remove it. This protects fair community access to the water. The largeness of the stone served as a safeguard against overwatering and ensured that the water was distributed evenly between herds. Verse 4, Jacob said to them, my brothers, where do you come from? They said, we are from Haran. He said to them, do you know Laban, son of Nahor? They said, we do. He said to them, is it well with him? Yes, they replied. And here is his daughter Rachel coming with the sheep. He said, look, it is still broad daylight. It is not time for the animals to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them. But they said, we cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep. So Jacob has arrived at the right place, but not exactly at the right time. Our minds might go back to the story of his father Isaac, who also arrived at a well at just the right time to meet Jacob's mother, Rebecca. And what do I mean by not exactly the right time? Well, true, Rachel arrives around the time that he gets there. And So his arrival corresponds well with Rachel's arrival. And upon first blush, she is the perfect match. His uncle's daughter, a close relative, being preferred. And we will learn later that she is beautiful. So what gives? Also, she is shepherding the sheep, which was not customary in her day. Clark Williamson writes, women were seldom shepherdesses in those days, so we realize that she exercised unusual agency like many other women in Genesis. And so the story is setting her apart as a woman who is different and more capable, and to be preferred above other women who maybe wouldn't be leading the sheep or shepherding a flock. But here's the rub. Jacob has arrived too early and must await the arrival of other shepherds with their flocks before the heavy stone covering the well can be removed. And why is that important? Well, Jacob cannot have a private conversation with her until that happens. And so Jacob is impatient. And why is this narrative thread even in the story? Well, because to move that stone will be a superhuman feat of strength, which will set Jacob apart from your common ordinary man. More on that in a second. Verse 9, while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. Now when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his mother's brother Laban, and the sheep of his mother's brother Laban, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of his mother's brother Laban. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. So Jacob does not have time to wait for the other flocks to arrive and the other shepherds to move the heavy stone. He will not be deterred. Desperate to meet Rachel sooner rather than later, he takes the initiative to move the stone from the well by himself, a truly remarkable feat. Anxious to speak with Rachel alone when he finds out who she is, Jacob suggests to the shepherds that they water their sheep and take them out to pasture, but they refuse because not all of their group are present. Disregarding the rules of the shepherds, Jacob, with Herculean strength, removes the stone from the mouth of the well by himself and waters the flocks of Laban, his mother's brother. By doing this, we learn three things about Jacob. One, obviously, he's quite taken with Rachel. Two, Fritham writes, this act establishes Jacob as a person of both strength and authority within this unfamiliar community. Jacob, the father of Israel, is a man to be reckoned with. We know this by the initiative that he takes to go ahead and buck tradition and the habits, the patterns, the customs of the various shepherds, and he removes the stone himself. And the fact that he's capable of doing it himself is in and of itself something that is remarkable. And then third, we learn that Jacob is an industrious and is capable of hard labor, a man who takes charge and makes things happen. Upon hearing of these goings on, Laban will wonder how these attributes might be put to his own use in the years to come. Keep this in mind as we read what follows. In fact, you can make the argument that Jacob's labor for Laban in pursuit of Rachel begins here in this story as he waters Laban's flocks before even being asked. Verse 13, when Laban heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, he ran to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him a month. Laban's greeting is warm and inviting. He embraces and kisses Jacob. He brings him into his house. He uses language reminiscent of Adam's words to Eve in Genesis 2, verse 23, and saying, surely you are my bone and my flesh. When considering what is about to follow, the reader may well wonder at the authenticity of Laban's apparent joy at receiving his relative. It may well be that Laban is already thinking hard about how he can turn this situation to his advantage. Biblical scholars are split on Laban's motives, whether or not we are to read his initial reception of Jacob as genuine or whether he's playing it up on purpose to set Jacob up for what will follow. And we don't know. Verse 15, then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, Should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me what shall your wages be? Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and when they seemed to him but a few days, because of the love he had for her. An opportunity for Laban to benefit by his nephew's visit soon presents itself. The opportunity is prompted by a blunt statement made by Laban in verse 15. Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me what your wages shall be. Basically says, it's time for you to leave, or for me to be able to profit by supporting you and feeding you and putting you up with lodging. We already know about Rachel, but now a second daughter is introduced, Leah. As the story unfolds, we will learn of Jacob's strong preference for Rachel. Jacob's love for Rachel is so powerful that he pledges 7 years of unpaid labor in exchange for her as a wife, to which Laban agrees, which may seem surprising to modern readers, but remember that there is this thing called a bride price that is meant to accompany the bride, that the person who is going to marry the bride is meant to give the his new father-in-law. And so in this case, the 7 years of labor are in place of the customary bride price, as Jacob is in no position to offer a fit bride price as he is on the run. Also, one last note about Leah's eyes. The Hebrew word here translated as lovely is hard to translate, and it may mean weak. Did Leah have weak eyes or lovely eyes? And the truth is, we don't know. We don't know. Some posit that she may have had weak eyes, whatever that means, as a possible reason for him preferring Rachel and her beauty over Leah. But it's a difficult Hebrew word to translate. It's very rare, and scholars don't quite know what to make of it. It's more often these days translated as lovely or soft or delicate, but it could be weak as well. Before we move on, I would like to talk about romantic love in biblical times. And to do that, I have written down a few quotes from some of the scholars that I consulted for this week's lesson. Clark Williamson writes, the Bible seldom mentions romantic love between women and men, and previously has only spoken of such love between Isaac and Rebekah. So this is the second time that there is romantic love spoken of in the Torah. Thus, the reader recognizes the depth of feeling Jacob has for Rachel when the text says simply, Jacob loved Rachel. Handel writes in the Common English Bible Commentary, the depth of Jacob's love for Rachel makes the 7 years of labor seem but a few days. This is a rare expression of romantic love in the Bible outside the Song of Solomon, and its intensity will extend to her children, Joseph and Benjamin, after Rachel's death. Ebeling writes, Jennifer Ebeling, who wrote the book on the lives of women in biblical times, since most marriages were parentally arranged, how did love factor into it? Love and courting are found in the stories of Jacob and Rachel, and Samson and Delilah, and in normal practice, a man takes a woman he loves as a wife. Men are typically the ones who actively love their wives, however, and the only time a woman is described as loving a man in the Hebrew Bible is when Saul's daughter Michal loved David. In this case, it is a princess who is in love with a male commoner, making it acceptable. All in all, we do well to remember that love in marriage could by no means be assumed in biblical times, as we'll see late just in a few verses, especially next week's lesson, between Jacob and Leah. So love can be by no means be assumed in biblical times, and I hope you can see by now throughout the course of these arranged marriages and the marriages that we've seen that it was not the driving force behind the arrangement of marriages. They had far more to do with contracts between tribes, between families, the exchange of property and property rights and keeping property in the family, and the acquisition of wealth, and perhaps most importantly, the siring of offspring or a lineage. These are things that keep coming up again and again. And all of this can be quite jarring because since really the late 1700s or the 1800s, when romantic literature and romantic art really captured our culture's attention, nowadays we marry because we fall in love primarily, and those other things are often subsidiary. And so this is a different cultural lens that we're experiencing. Except for this one feels so familiar because Jacob and Rachel are in love. This is a love story. Verse 21. Then Jacob, yeah, I know that picture. I couldn't find. Well, anyway. Verse 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed." I'm going to pause there. I thought for sure that we would have a very clear sexual innuendo here, that I may go into her. Turns out in the Hebrew, that is not at all implied. It really does mean arrive at, go to approach. Sometimes it's used to describe going into a home or house. Sometimes it describes person's arrival at a certain place. I could find no instance in the several dozen that I looked up of this Hebrew word where this had any kind of sexual connotation. I don't know what, that's not really an important point to make, but I also wonder at why in the English, in the New Revised Standard Version, and in others, it's translated in this way, because it just seems to imply in a patriarchal context, a man using a woman. And that is actually not implicit in the Hebrew. So I thought I'd point that out. And I was sure I would find otherwise, but it just wasn't the case. So I digress. Verse 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may go in to her, for my time is completed." So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went in to her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah as his daughter Leah to be her maid. When morning came, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Jacob's seeming plaintive question at the end of verse 25 may well draw little sympathy at this point. After all, Jacob has already shown himself to be at least just as deceptive, if not more so, than Laban. Again, see the story in Genesis chapter 27, where he stole his brother's birthright in that case, but his inheritance in another situation. No, the blessing in 27, and the birthright in chapter 25. Handel writes, "The issues of the rights of the firstborn, trickery between father and son, divisions in who loves whom, and even the ability to even the ability to see." So let me restart that quote. "The issues of rights of the firstborn, trickery between father and son, divisions in who loves whom, and even the ability to see echo the story of the deception of Isaac in chapter 27. This time the roles are reversed. Jacob becomes the trickster tricked, paying a price for his previous deeds. Jacob is deceived by his father-in-law, who, marrying his firstborn daughter, because he cannot see who she is during the night." Green writes, "The words betray in 29 verse 25 and deceitfully back in Genesis chapter 27:35 come from the same Hebrew word." And so they're both of these players, Jacob and Laban, are dealing in deceptive, duplicitous ways. Green goes on to write, "Now, however, he is now the deceived, he being Jacob, whereas previously the younger brother had replaced the older, now the older sister replaces the younger." Clark Williamson writes, "While contemporary folk may not understand how Jacob could have made this mistake, the narrative either assumed that ancient people would be familiar with how such a thing could happen. The bride wore a veil, it was night, or was not concerned about such details. The point is that Jacob has been duped in the way that he duped Esau and Isaac." And so we have themes of blindness. In this case, Jacob, it's nighttime and he can't see, and then there's the veil. And so the ruse was done in the cover of darkness, as was the case with Isaac, who was blind. And Jacob tricked his father to reverse the roles, where the younger takes place over the elder. And now Laban tricks the trickster, Jacob, to reverse the roles, or rather to set back to proper order the roles of his daughters, having the first married instead of the younger, as Laban will claim is the custom in the next verse. And we have no reasons to doubt him. Verse 26. Laban said, "This is not done in our country. giving the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one. By the way, the wedding process, the ceremony, the celebration lasted about a week. So he's basically saying, let's get through this week of wedding stuff. Complete the week with this one, and we will give you and the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. He served Laban for another 7 years. Fritham writes, Laban's appeal to tradition after the fact appears duplicitous, but by directly raising firstborn issues, he establishes an explicit link with Jacob's own deception on the same matter. His reference to our country functions similarly. In matching deception for deception, the narrator must have understood Jacob's activity in chapter 27 as reprehensible. Jacob must now know something of how Esau felt. At the same time, he has met in Laban someone not unlike himself. And another important point about that, this is not done in our country, including Jacob in the customs and the practices of his ancestral homeland. He's basically saying, you knew better than this. And that implies that he knew better, of course, back in chapter 27, when he reversed the customs that they carried with them from the homeland into Canaan, where Jacob tricked Isaac. And now Laban has flipped the script. Also consider, because of Leah's deception, Leah becomes Jacob's first or primary wife. Rachel, whom Jacob loves more, becomes his second wife. Given all that we've learned thus far in regards household hierarchies and power dynamics, we can assume that Laban's subverting of Jacob's attempt to reverse custom will have long-term effects. Indeed, this is but the beginning of an intense rivalry between these sisters, one that will carry on through their children. These double dealings will have a ripple effect as treacherous dealings often, or perhaps always, do. Laban, on the other hand, seems to make off quite well for now. In giving both daughters away in marriage, he has doubled the bride price and has secured a total of 14 years of free labor. That's where we're going to stop for today, because it's a natural division in the narrative, as the next week's lesson will be about there's two women's rivalry, there's two sisters' rivalry, Rachel and Leah, especially as it centers around one daughter's ability to produce children and the other's inability. But some takeaways before we open things back up for discussion. And I'm going to quote Fritham at length from the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. Laban's ruse, made possible through the use of veils and heavy festival drinking, violates Rachel and Jacob and their love for each other. It violates Leah as well, whose feelings about the matter are not considered, but whose suffering in all of this will shortly be voiced. God responds to her laments first of all, while Rachel remains childless initially. Neither woman speaks directly in verses 1 through 30. Their lives are arranged for them. The same also obtains for Zilpah and Bilhah, maids customarily given to a bride by her father. The fact that God responds in so many ways to Leah's suffering in the next episode reveals the divine perspective on her mistreatment and an implicit judgment on her oppressors. She bears 7 children, more than all the others, but in doing so, the Leah-Rachel conflict intensifies. And I conclude, all in all, Leah, Zilpah, Rachel, and Bilhah are all treated poorly and robbed of volition by the men in this story. And as we will read on, Zilpah and Bilhah, both servants, will have children by way of Jacob, and those will be counted amongst the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. The ones that Zilpah has will be accredited basically to Leah, and the ones that Bilhah has will be accredited basically to Rachel, which is, I think, very unfair. Clark Williamson, wait, before I get to that, next point. When considering Jacob's role in this, we may well see this story as an example of the old saying, what goes around comes around. This is perhaps the main point of this part of the narrative. Jacob is deceived in darkness just as he deceived his father in his blindness. Jacob subverted societal norms in positioning himself as secondborn ahead of the firstborn, Esau. But this time the custom is honored by way of another deception. Leah, the firstborn, becomes the first wife in her house. Williamson writes, in an era when deception is commonplace in business and politics, a preacher could use the story of Jacob to indicate the consequences of deception. Even if deceivers are not personally exposed, the practice of deception undermines community, as we will see. This is me. These are my words. I am yet again taken by the extent to which inequitable power structures feed resentments, anger, double dealing, and violence. Esau was given primacy, much to Jacob and Rebekah's chagrin. They plot to reverse the cultural norms, thus pitting brother against brother. Leah and Rachel now find themselves in competition. Leah as the firstborn, chief wife whose children will have primacy over Rachel's if the custom is kept. And yet Rachel is loved and Leah is not. It would seem that inequities and consequent hatred and resentment were baked into society's fabric. If only all persons in these stories had been treated with equal worth and value. How if the family farms had been equally divided? How if women were given voice in the decisions made for them concerning their marriages and childbearing? Question to end on. I wonder what inequities in our modern power structures are fueling similar hatreds and resentments. And as we will see moving forward, that these complex family dynamics are not anywhere near over, and it will impact how Jacob treats the children of his two wives. And as we get into the Joseph story, you may remember it starts out with a bunch of brothers, elder brothers, taking issue with the way that Joseph is treated in preference to them, when their cultural norms would have dictated that the eldest, which I believe was Simeon, maybe Sue can help me out with that.
No, I don't think it's that. I knew at one time. Levi was fourth and third, and I just read that someplace.
Reuben was the first.
Reuben,
You got
right. And Reuben's the one that messed up. So he got kicked out.
Right.
Yeah, it's right there at the end of you're talking about Leah's sons. It was Leah,
Yeah,
Levi,
Leah's son.
Judah, Reuben, Levi, and Judah.
I had to deliberately resist talking more about Leah's children, because next week we will be talking about not only their children, the rivalry, but also their children. And there are some redemptive.
Well, there is. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's not. I was wrong. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So sorry.
But my point of bringing them up. No, it's okay. My point in bringing them up is these. You have to wonder if there had been a more equitable power structure within family units back then. And I would actually hold up our modern conceptions, as imperfect as they sometimes can be, as better. I don't prefer it. I make every effort to make sure that my children do not get the sense that I am holding one up over the other in sense of worth and sense of attention and all of these things. And consequently, the worst thing they fight about aren't the important issues. They fight about whether or not Abel knocked down a tower, or whether June was playing with Josie's toy at the wrong time. And they love each other, at least, and they're young and things can change. But I have seen in families where there was a clear favorite. I have a good friend now where these dynamics are very apparent in the treatment of his parents with his siblings, and it creates all sorts of problems. And I think in this story, we see Jacob reaping the consequences and coming up on the losing end partially. Of course, he's not quite done tricking people, but you have to wonder, as it relates to the two sisters, how things might have been different. If Jacob had just been able to marry the girl that he loved in this circumstance, and Leah had been able to marry somebody who wanted her. I saw one picture that I almost shared just because I like to share the ones that I find humorous, but there's a picture of this I guess, conventionally, it was an unflattering picture of a woman, and it was just captioned Leah, the girl that nobody wanted. And we don't know that from this story. No. All we know is that Jacob didn't want her in the context of really wanting this other girl and being tricked into taking her as a wife. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
So I have a couple of things I'd like to point out. You mentioned that the women were not usually shepherdess, mm-hmm. but Jethro's daughters were shepherdess. And I believe there may be one or two other times, I'm not sure, but I do know for sure Jethro's was. So even though it wasn't common, it did happen.
And you're talking about the father of Moses's future wife, and they meet at a well in a very similar way.
Yes, mm-hmm. And he protects them at the well.
Another one of those well stories. They often meet at wells.
Yeah, that's true. And I thought it was interesting that he was willing to work at hard labor. Now, to me, the picture that's been presented in the chapter before is he stayed in the tent and didn't do a lot of work. And mm-hmm. So I think his attitude or values had to have changed if he's become a person of hard labor. I don't think he was open to it.
Well, there aren't a lot of love stories, as was pointed out in the Hebrew Bible. I don't know if you'd call Isaac and Rebecca a love story. You can tell that Isaac really wants to marry Rebecca, that's for sure. Samson and Delilah is another love story that was mentioned. Then there are those stories of passion, David and Bathsheba, but they're not really the norm. And in this story, I think we are meant to take away from it in part that Jacob is so drawn to, so drawn to Rachel that he's willing to, he lifts the stone. I never growing up really understood the significance of him picking up this stone that was supposed to be so heavy that you had to wait for all of the other shepherds to arrive so that nobody is taking an unfair share of water. And he like, I think I like the way that the author I quoted said, in Herculean fashion, it's his superhuman strength moves it for his passionate desire to have a word with Rachel, send off the rest of the shepherds out with their sheep, and then waters the flock without being asked, and then is willing to work 7 years, but it just seems like a few days because he's so in love, and he only really becomes upset with the arrangement when he learns that he has to take on another wife, which he then gladly has several children with. So
that I find it hard to understand this bit about in verse 20. It said, so he served for 7 years, but it seemed like only a few days because of his love for her. That doesn't make sense to me. It seems to me like if I had to wait 7 years for a wife, it would make me think, oh, is this ever going to end? I've only done it 2 years and I've still got 5 to go. I just found that statement kind of funny. And plus the fact here in the first month, he is welcomed and he stays evidently in the home of Laban. And then after that, is he banished to a tent on his own or something during all these 7 years? It would seem to me like he would still be seeing Rachel during this time.
Communities were rather tight-knit, comprised of, dozens to a few hundred persons. So yeah, he would have been part of that community. Even the different wives had their own tents. Those were the sleeping arrangements. Okay. And so that's why you might every now and then picked up on a detail that Abraham or one of the patriarchs will go into the tent of his wife. So the wives had their own tent. So he probably had his own tent, would be my guess. And as far as that 7 years being a few days, I've got to think that is it's a love story. And those love stories are often, especially the love story that is fueled by a passion fit to move a boulder. You've got to think that there may be some rhetorical flourish.
I mean, I'm thinking of the two it could have been the first time for elopement, if he would have had anything to live on, if they would have just gotten out of there, just think of what it would have saved.
Well, you couldn't really live up. That was the whole thing too.
Yeah.
If you didn't have ties to a tight-knit community,
Mhm.
you were as good as dead. Which
Right.
is why treatment for the stranger and the foreigner was so important in the ethics of the Middle East during this time, and why you read so much of the Bible spent on describing how to treat a guest and how to entertain. And we see that one of the hallmarks of the patriarchs' virtue, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is their ability or their willingness to treat the foreigner. And oftentimes they're entertaining an angel or a divine personage, but their willingness to treat them well. But that was an ethic ingrained in the culture, because if you were wandering by yourself, you better quickly find a community that had a water supply and food source that you could at least temporarily enmesh in for your own survival. And of course, the way that what you really needed was a network of persons, which is what made these marriages and these arrangements so important too, because you were thinking about the longevity of your own tribe and the longevity and the other. It was kind of you were helping someone else by, for one of a better way of putting it, shipping off a daughter for a price. But you were also gaining material goods by which your community would survive, but then also understanding that you were solidifying the bonds of camaraderie with other neighboring tribes and families. Because who knows, in times of famine or in times of war or times of distress, how much you might need those communities outside of your own to depend on. And so that's what made Hagar's situation so dire, being sent out alone, why she sat down prepared to die, because she and like God's promise to her and for in saving the life of Ishmael and promising a way forward for Ishmael was so significant and astonishing in what movie.
So does it become clearer in the next two parts of the novella, like Laban's motivations? Like you said, we don't know exactly why. I mean, do you think he just needed 14 years of servitude, or did he need to unload Leah? Or
well, unloading Leah would not have been, unfortunately, a very uncommon way of looking at what you wanted to do with your daughters. They couldn't give you offspring that were yours. That your sons could carry on the family lineage and keep the property in place. The deeds to the land didn't go with your daughters, and so they were mouths to feed. You needed to find. Yeah, it's really unfortunate, and that's that actually stays with us. I think that the most subtle way that still manifests today is when people told me after I had two daughters, I bet you really want a son. Well, why do I really want a son? Like, I don't need to have I love Abel. I'm glad I have a son. I was actually ready for another daughter because it's what I was used to, but I kept getting told, when you're going to have that boy, I wonder if that doesn't have some carryover with this perception that it's through the sons that, our names.
The name, I was going to say, the names carried on. Yeah.
Speaking from my own situation, where I only have two sons, I can't tell you how many times we sit at the dinner table at family dinners, and this was before they were married. And I sat there and tried to participate in the conversation as much as I could, but it was all male stuff. And it would have been nice to have a female around. And even now, because of Samantha's weird work schedule, maybe I only, there's no way I see her more than twice a month. So there's still many a times it's just me and the men folk.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It is different.
But it was not until pretty recently that women couldn't work. they really weren't allowed to work. And then, women's pay is still not equal to men's, even in, professional circles. They're still, they're not equal to men's. And in many ways, women's ability to pull their own weight by no fault of their own is not the same. Women couldn't take out mortgages. They couldn't have credit card. I mean, all this is kind of pretty recent. So they probably, women probably have been a burden, but it wasn't their fault. It was imposed on them for a long time.
I'm not going to say that women were a burden, because if it weren't for the women, there are a lot of men that wouldn't have gotten where they got.
You betcha.
It's the value that we culturally place on what's humming along in the background without the accolades.
That's right.
But to your question about Laban, he's not over yet. He is throughout Jacob's time here working an angle.
This is just the beginning of the puzzle. It's going to get a lot more complicated before we get there.
And it ends with Jacob kind of working his own angle within a system that Laban tried to set up to disadvantage Jacob, and Jacob will flee.
He's blessed by the Lord.
Yeah, he will flee, and then there's the story between them ends with some form of reconciliation, kind of a. Well, we'll get to. I don't want to fall too hard into that, which will bring us up to his reunion with Esau, which is coming up.
Yeah. So.
Well, thank you for hanging in there and joining today. Next week we will be considering the starting with verse 30 and going on into the 30th chapter, ending with verse 24.
Oh, verse 24.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what
Thanks a bunch. Larry and I are enjoying this. We have you on a big screen, so we sit on the chair. We're not in front of the computer. We sit on the side. And we could see all your pictures and all that stuff. And it's really been very helpful. That's why we wonder why you don't see us, because we're not sitting in front of the computer.
Hey, that's okay. Thank you for chiming in. It's glad to know you're there. And I'll have to make sure that I don't have any food on my face or anything like that, since I'm in such high definition on your big screen.
Don't worry about that. We look terrible, so you don't want you to see us anyway. We're usually not dressed, and we, hair unwashed, uncombed.
So now I have John Lennon and Yoko Ono in my mind, Janet, without comment. So, all right. So anyway, will it be a regular time next week?
Yes, I would not have been. Like I said, after the last time we met at 2:30, that I wanted continuity, but I had to miss a Zoom call because of Paul Crow's graveside funeral. Okay. And at that Zoom call, the group that I meet with, it's a group of other pastors and seminarians, where it's a network of mutual support. They scheduled the meeting for today between 10:30 and 2:30. So that was I found that out on Friday. So that's what happened.
Okay.
And since I missed the last one,
we're not going anywhere anyway.
That's about right.
Well, 2 o'clock.
We just sit in our homes.
Well, 2 o'clock. Make sure Nancy Lamb can't join us when we have it at 2:30 because of her work schedule. So I like to keep it at 2, if only for her. Anyhow, God bless you, and I'll see John tomorrow at Food Pantry. I'll see you, Connie, tomorrow, and take care of yourselves. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thanks.